Hey everyone, Dr. B again. This is the second part of the intro to the course and assignments for Social Work 502. In my previous video, I talked about the weekly discussion posts, the quizzes, I talked about the conditions presentation, and in this video, I want to talk about the clinical vignettes. There are two clinical vignettes, and so I want to start with the clinical vignette 1, which is due on week 4. So the vignettes build on each other. So you'll be the same individual that you will be concentrating on for vignette 1 will be the same individual that you will continue working on in terms of vignette 2. Okay, you're building on that assessment with that same individual. That doesn't mean you need to work with the individual throughout the semester. It just means that it will be the same individual that you will be continuing to assess in vignette 2. So, the purpose of the vignettes is to collect and organize data and apply critical thinking to interpret information related to the DSM-5. So, you will need to apply knowledge of human behavior, the person and environment, and the other multidisciplinary theoretical frameworks that we use in social work. Okay, so very important. And really what you need to, in terms of the individual the client that you will use for, or that you will be focusing your clinical vignettes on, needs to be somebody who you are able to do a clinical assessment towards a DSM diagnosis with. So that's really important, okay? So you want to select a person whose subculture is different from your own. Should ideally be a current client. Now, you should not, you really should not involve the client in this process. Rather, this is just taking what you know about this client, the work you've done with this client, any data sources that you have about this client, and then utilizing that into your vignette. So you're not actually going to be doing an assessment on somebody if you've not already done a clinical assessment on that individual, or if you can do the clinical assessment of this individual, but on your own, knowing what you know, the information that you have about this individual. So you don't want to say, I've got this assignment and let's sit down and do it together. That's not what you're being asked to do here. So that's really what you must be doing, is taking what you already know about your client and applying it, okay? And really, under no circumstances may you interview, assess, or question a current or past client for the purpose of this assignment. Again, as I mentioned, you're really not going to be doing this with them. You're doing this based on the information that you have about them, okay? And so that's really, really important. It is unethical to really bring them into a course assignment, okay? So you're not doing that. You're just taking a client that you have or had previously that you can do a clinical assessment on. So I hope that makes sense, okay? If you do not have, you're not currently in field, or you're not in a field placement where you're working with individuals that you feel that you could do a clinical assessment on, or there's other obstacles to doing a clinical assessment with somebody at your current field placement or your actual work of employment, then there is other things you could do. I've had students in the past look at, series and pick a character, and they'll watch a few episodes, or a book, somebody from a novel, or maybe somebody from that we know about, a serial killer, or somebody that's famous. You can choose something along those lines, and that is absolutely okay to do. And I've had students be very successful in doing this, and so that's something that you're able to do as well. Now, in your first vignette, this first part of your vignette includes just some basic information about you know, your role, your client, the context in which you work with them, their information. So you're going to do an introduction of explain your role with the client and in what context you work with this person. I'm an intern at agency A, and I am doing substance abuse work, and this individual is a current client or was a client. Now, really do not use this individual's real name, any identifying information, no pictures, nothing. I mean, any identifying information, please change it, okay? Be as confidential as you can, and again, you cannot interview them for this assignment. Data sources. What are your data sources for the report? Is it from talking to this individual, talking to family members, friends, from case notes, from working with other individuals or talking to other individuals who have worked with this person? What are your data sources? Identifying information sort of about this individual, you know, their age, their gender, their sexual orientation, religion, spirituality, cultural elements, anything that you feel needs to be, you know, that is important for you to enlist here. What is the presenting problem? And it should be a concise description of the presenting problem, right? And really, you want to, again, this should be somebody that you're able to build a clinical assessment and therefore come to a clinical DSM diagnosis versus somebody that came in because their only really issue is that they need help with groceries for the week. I mean, if that's the extent, then this is not the person that you should be using in your work. If that's the extent of the interaction you had with them, and that's what I'm saying, there's other options if you don't have anybody that you can be able to do this with. So the presenting problem, chief complaint, the history of the presenting problem. So I'm not going to read all of these. You have these right here. The psychosocial history. Tell me about the individual and their family history. And you know, as you keep going down, the rubric will have more information as well. Current diagnoses and medications, and your diagnostic assessment. Okay, and so I'm going to tell you what I mean by diagnostic assessment. So if you come on down, you'll see the rubric, which is going to give you some additional information for each of these steps. Okay, so like for instance, the history of the presenting problem, what led up to referral for services based on the presenting problem, which again should not be came because needed groceries or needed a referral to something. It needs to be something that you can build a clinical diagnosis on. And then there's subheadings. The history and context of the situation. Is the problem recent or long-standing? Describes the course of the problem development. When did it begin? What led to the presenting problem? Did the person request help, or were they mandated to receive help? What is the client's expectation of help? What would they like from you? Then the psychosocial history is, now, if you're doing some of this with a character in a book or from a series, you know, some people have used In Treatment. If you've ever watched In Treatment, that's a great show. It's on HBO. You know, I mean, it's not currently running, but you can, if you have access to HBO, you can see them. You can also find them online through like Amazon or and rent the videos. So, you know, you can gather some of this information from hopefully, you know, the videos that you're watching. Again, pick characters that you can do a clinical assessment on. All right, the psychosocial history, we talked about that. Because that's part of the, you know, the history of the presenting problem. The strengths, supports, and resources. Your view. What is the view of the problem, and what are your expectations that you have of your client? And then again, you know, and this is all part of up here where I was talking about the psychosocial history, right? There's just that the rubric has more information. And then you get to the current diagnosis and medications, and then the diagnostic assessment. The diagnostic assessment has several parts, and we're going to look at them right here. Right? So the first thing is, this is where the diagnostic assessment starts. What are the behavioral manifestations that lead you to believe that this individual is having an issue here, right? And what have they told you about what are the symptoms, like if schizophrenia, I mean, or somebody that's hearing voices, delusions, those are typically associated with one of the schizophrenia or one of the other related schizophrenia forms, okay, or conditions, diagnoses. What are the risk factors here? Then you want to think about what are your provisional diagnoses. You want to identify 3 from each of the categories of diagnoses that we have been talking about up until you know this assignment is due. So you want to think about what could potentially be 3 diagnoses from DSM. Maybe you're thinking ADHD could be one, and that's from the neurodevelopmental, and one could be from the actually neurodevelopmental comes later, but you know what I'm saying. Just from what are your provisional diagnoses from these categories that we have here, right? And then for each of these provisional diagnoses, identify which of the person's behavior, signs, symptoms are evidence of specific DSM criteria. So you would say, okay, I believe it is this diagnosis, and his delusions and hearing voices, that's part of schizophrenia criteria A, which states that this is common. So you would match them up for each of the provisional diagnoses, right? Then you would do a differential diagnosis. Now, a differential diagnosis is a diagnosis that you feel best meets what you think is happening with your client, but you're not 100% sure, so you're not making it your final diagnosis at this point. You will do that in the second vignette, but at this point you feel this is a differential diagnosis. This is the one that meets sufficient DSM criteria to become what you feel could potentially be the final diagnosis here. But at this time, you're listing as differential diagnosis and explain your rationale for that. And then, so this should be one of those 3, right? And then talk about which others you ruled out. If you have 3 provisional diagnoses, 1 will be your differential and 2 should be your ruled out. Why did you rule them out? Give us a, talk to us about that. Tell me why you ruled that out. Okay, so this is the first vignette. The second vignette builds on this. The very first part of the second vignette is you are going to copy and paste all of your paper up until and you will include up to the diagnostic assessment, okay? But then you're going to do another diagnostic assessment. So we're going to go to that next. So basically everything that you did here for vignette 1, you will copy and paste, and that'll be the beginning of vignette 2. Okay, so as I mentioned, for vignette 2, you're going to just bring everything from vignette 1 up to including the diagnostic assessment, right? But then, and you can update any information on the diagnostic assessment, and you're going to redo your diagnostic assessment. So if you come all the way down here, this is where this one starts. You're going to start again with behavioral manifestation signs, the risks, those things. And the reason you're doing that is this is really, if it's the same, go ahead and copy it, but this is an opportunity if you're seeing other things or other things came, now that you've read about more diagnoses. Now by week 6, you also have read about diagnoses that you hadn't read about in by the time that the first assignment was due, by the time vignette 1 was due. But now you're like, you know what? Maybe these are other signs and symptoms that I'm noticing, not eating well, maybe. So, that you hadn't paid attention to, but now have based on new information that you have. So you're just going to update anything that you feel is necessary here in terms of the behavioral manifestations and the risk factors. But you are going to redo your diagnostic assessment in terms of the provisional diagnoses, and then for each of the provisional diagnoses, you're going to match the behavioral manifestation, symptom, signs with the specific DSM criteria that it meets for each of the diagnoses that you chose for your provisional diagnoses. You'll do another differential diagnosis, and then From that differential, and then you will then get a working diagnosis, which is your final diagnosis. And you will do a